Today's event is the last in our Fall 2023 Humanities Forum series, which is a public lecture series. And we are planning the Spring 2024 season already. It's just about finished. I just want to share with you a little tidbit for the spring semester. Actually, on February 12th, 2024, we're going to host our Daphne Harrison lecture with Naomi Andre, David G. Fry, Distinguished Professor of Music at UNC Chapel Hill, who will discuss the evolution of opera as it begins to cater to more diverse audiences and embrace a broader mission that engages social justice in movements around Me Too, queer and trans spectrums, and Black Lives Matter. It's going to be part concert and part lecture, and UMBC's Jubilee Singers, under the direction of Janice Jackson, will be performing. So this is going to be a stellar event. So mark your calendars and check back in at the Dresser Center website, dressercenter.umbc.edu, for more information. So before we begin, I'm just going to make a couple of announcements. First, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established on the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous peoples connected to this place. And while we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that truth-telling is only a small gesture, and we must take action towards the necessary work of repair. This afternoon's event is being recorded, and as I said, will be made available later on the UMBC YouTube page. And finally, I want to thank the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for co-sponsoring this event, and invite Kimberly Moffitt, Dean of COST, to introduce our Lipitz speaker.
Good afternoon. We are in for a treat, so I will be brief and take the moment to introduce this year's Lipitz Professor, which recognizes, this professorship recognizes superior achievements in teaching, mentoring, and scholarship. And during 30 years, almost 30 years here at UMBC,
More than 30.
Dr. Vaporis has developed a series of courses, engaged tremendous scholarship, and certainly mentored several of our undergraduate and graduate students. Areas of teaching have focused on developing courses in Japanese history, gender history, and Asian studies. And most impressively, he served as the brainchild behind our very popular Asian Studies program and served as the inaugural director for 6 years. Several books in terms of his scholarship. What he, of course, has made his mark as an innovative and a stellar scholar is in the area of his samurai studies. His second monograph, Tour of Duty, Samurai, Military Service in Edo and the Culture of Early Modern Japan, was published in 2008. Continuing that work, he did so in his fourth, we can go through all of them, but I'm just going to highlight his fourth book, which was Samurai, an Encyclopedia of Japan's Cultured Wars. This book was then expanded to be most recently entitled The Samurai Encyclopedia, the Comprehensive Guide to Japan's Elite Warrior Class, and there are several others. I also wanted to highlight just a couple of his honors. Again, over a 30-year career, it is not possible to highlight all of them, but just a few that I think are very important. The UMBC Presidential Research Professor in 2013 to 2016. Also, a nice moniker that doesn't always rise to the level of how academics talk, but they're important to us if we see ourselves as teacher-scholar. In 2013, he was selected as Professor Not to Miss by current and former UMBC students. Very important. I love that one. 2001, a fellowship in Korean Studies by Korea Society, and then also the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship for college teachers. The list goes on and on. I think the man of the hour is who you want to hear more from, so I will step aside and simply introduce you to this year's Lipitz professor, Dr. Constantine Vaporis, who will speak to us about the Black Ships, Commodore Perry, American Exceptionalism, and the opening of Japan, 1852 to 1854. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dean Moffett, and thank you to everyone for coming out at this time of year when I know everyone is so busy. I'm happy to be here in person. Almost 2 years ago to this day, I was supposed to be here, but something called COVID happened. And actually, this is the first occasion to give an in-person talk on research, I think since 2018. I had enough of online talks, so I'm glad that there are living people in front of me and that I can get some really nice feedback afterwards on this topic, which is kind of brave new waters for me. So it's with some trepidation that I enter these waters. But first of all, I'd like to thank, of course, Dean Moffett and the selection committee that bestowed me the honor of the Lipitz Fellowship, that gave me the release time from teaching to be able to focus on research, completing a book on the samurai, one that I talked about 2 years ago, but not today. And also to begin this new research project on the Black Ships. So thanks as well to the Drescher Center for the Humanities and its director Jessica Berman for hosting the lecture, and Courtney Hobson for organizing it and creating that really beautiful poster. Thank you so much. Of course, I have to thank Roger Lipitz and the Lipitz Family Foundation. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge two graduate student research assistants, Wendy Dunaway, who couldn't be here today, and Julie Kim. Hey, Julie, thank you. In the case of Julie, not just for helping to unearth what is an unimaginable volume of documents, but also with their help in helping to transcribe a number of the handwritten letters, some of which I'll be using here today. At least some of you might be wondering why a historian of Japan would be giving a talk on a topic in American history, one which admittedly involves Japan, but only as the object and not the main subject of inquiry. The answer lies with the fact that I've been teaching the story of the American so-called opening of Japan for more than 30 years now, without fully understanding the American side of the story. Even after reading a good deal of the material on the subject, I was left wanting to know more about the background for the planning of the mission, its reception in American society, but particularly about the human dimension of the expedition sent by the U.S. government. I became interested in the experience of the crew. In particular, I'm intrigued by the inclusion of a small but important cadre of intellectuals who joined the expedition that you can see here. Civilians who were referred to as artists, men like Wilhelm Hein, second from the left, perhaps America's most famous lithographer of his day, and Bayard Taylor, second from the right, who was one of the most famous man of letters of mid-19th century America that you've probably never even heard of. Why did Hein and Taylor and the others, whom I'll introduce later, want to participate? How and why were they selected? What was their experience like? And what came of their participation? In other words, what became of the knowledge they gained from the expedition, and what impact might it have had on American society, its perceptions of Japan, and America's relations with Japan? And on the individual level, how did their experience on the expedition impact their lives afterwards? My talk today represents a first effort to cross boundaries into the transnational realm of American and Japanese history, but also a continuation of my interest in biography. And I look forward to your comments later about where I might take this research. The December 6th date of this talk, coming as it does one day before that infamous day in history when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, was an unconscious decision. But as will become clear today, there was a connection between that day and the events that lie at the heart of this lecture. First, some historical context, and apologies to those for whom this is already a very familiar story. But why did Japan need to be open, and why was the U.S. interested in being the country to do so? Well, the quick answer is that Japan was largely closed to the West after the 1630s. The Tokugawa government, or shogunate, having expelled the Portuguese and the Spanish because their efforts to spread Christianity in Japan threatened the new regime. A small group of Dutch traders who were not interested in spreading the gospel were allowed to reside part of the year on the man-made island of Dejima as virtual prisoners. As a result, this restrictive foreign policy, some Westerners referred to Japan as a, quote, double-bolted nation. Those are the words of Herman Melville in Moby Dick. Or a nation from which the commerce of the whole world is shut out, even though Japan was not closed to its Asian neighbors. This sense of exclusionism grated on the American psyche and went against our sense of the just laws of nature, and in compelling us to cross the Pacific. More specifically, what drew Japan into America's orbit in the mid-19th century was the combination of the opening of Chinese ports to trade and the acquisition of Oregon and California, which made America a Pacific nation. A steady stream of maritime traffic between North America and East Asia soon followed. As sailing ships were replaced with steamships, American traders needed to secure coaling stations to acquire fuel and provisions to be able to make the long trip to China. Japan, of course, was conveniently located en route to China, and it was reported that the country had huge stocks of coal, which made it important to the further development of American trade. With the U.S. becoming a Pacific nation, notions of manifest destiny and the impulse to bring Christianity back to Japan, where it had been brutally persecuted in the early 1600s, also propelled U.S. interests, as seen in this romantic painting with the inscription U.S. Japan Fleet, Commodore Perry carrying the gospel of God to the heathen. In addition, the expansion of America's whaling industry into the Pacific Ocean increased the call for safe harbors, supply stations, and assistance for shipwrecked sailors. By the mid-19th century, the American whaling fleet was some 600 ships strong, with some 200 of them operating in the North Pacific, seemingly inundating the waters around Japan, as the image of whales do on this map. The issue of the alleged mistreatment of American seamen became a driving force behind the decision to send an expedition to Japan. Newspaper reports on the subject were often sensationalistic and full of what we call today fake news. Nevertheless, Commodore Perry, the leader of the expedition to open Japan, took advantage of this largely false perception to make a case for opening the country, when trade and the projection of American power were the main driving forces. While not all American leaders in business and politics thought Japan would become an important market for our export trade, all seem to have recognized the country's strategic importance in the further development of America's trade with China and the opening of steamship service between the U.S. and China. The clear aim was to prevent Britain from so dominating the China trade that there was no room left for the United States. Indeed, upon his return from the expedition to open Japan, Perry would in fact be feted by businessmen in New York City for his efforts. The Perry mission was not the first attempt to open Japan, not even the first American attempt. But in taking the assignment, Perry insisted on being given far greater latitude than the leader of the previous naval effort, led by Commodore James Biddle, who was not permitted to use any force against the Japanese. In Japan in 1846, Biddle's 2 warships were surrounded by native vessels, as suggested by this American lithograph, and when he left his ship to negotiate, he was deliberately pushed back into his boat by a Japanese seaman. Although a formal apology was later given, the Americans' failure to demand further satisfaction was perceived as weakness. Biddle was instructed to leave and not come back. And to add further insult to injury, he had to request that the Japanese tow his sailing ship out of the harbor to catch the winds. Learning from Biddle's experience, Perry demanded and received greater latitude in his orders from Secretary of State Webster, quote, full and discretionary powers, meaning the latitude to use force when necessary. He was appointed both commander of the squadron and the highest diplomatic representative of the U.S. government, charged with negotiating with the Japanese government and any other government his squadron encountered on its way to and from Japan. In fact, Perry was the only diplomat on board since he refused to allow any professional diplomats to accompany the mission. Perry was born into a famous naval family, had a distinguished family history that can be traced back all the way to the Mayflower. He was one of the Navy's most progressive and creative officers, the, quote, father of the steam Navy, with a distinguished service record over 4 decades. His various commands are illustrated on this monument to Perry in Tour Park in Newport, Rhode Island, especially, of course, the Japan expedition, which you see in the 2 photos. Interestingly, just down the street is allegedly the first street to have been lit with gas lights in America. By 1853, though, Old Bruin, or Old Matt, as Perry was sometimes referred to, behind his back, was a full 59 years old and suffering from rheumatism that often put him out of sorts. But he still had a full head of black hair, although some thought it a wig. Nevertheless, Japan was to be the highlight of an already illustrious career, and that is why he sought the command, though it should be noted he was not the first choice for the job. At this early stage in my research, I would argue that the Perry expedition's importance in U.S. history has been undervalued, underestimated in part because the various efforts to publicize America's achievement afterwards were soon overshadowed by the domestic crisis that was unfolding in the U.S., the rising tension over states' rights, and of course by the Civil War and its aftermath. The expedition was likely the largest overseas force dispatched to date in peacetime. And by taking the lead in opening Japan, the U.S. asserted its position in the world over Britain. According to the Boston newspaper, Our Country, the expedition was, quote, heralded to the world as a great national achievement, one of the most important ever undertaken by our government, end quote. There was a race to open Japan, and the U.S. intended to win it. Because of the interest of other countries in Japan, though, the Fillmore administration was careful to maintain a level of secrecy about the expedition, and this made it subject to partisan political attacks. Given that Britain had its hands full in China with the Opium Wars and in India, where it would soon be engaged in suppressing the First Indian War of Independence, Russia was in fact America's main competition. According to the New York Tribune, there was great fear Russia would do what it could to ensure the American squadron a hostile reception in Japan. In fact, Russia sent an expedition that arrived in Japan just a couple of weeks after Perry. In other words, there was a sprint to the finish line, and the U.S. was lucky to have won. By winning the race, the U.S. was able to set the terms of the treaties that followed between Japan and the other Western powers, thus integrating Japan into the global system in which it would remain an integral part until the calamitous Second World War. To achieve his aims in 1852, Perry, together with the Secretary of the Navy, made plans to put together a formidable naval force. The imposing size of the squadron was well publicized in the U.S. This image from the weekly newspaper Gleason's Pictorial depicted 12 ships, and the accompanying article claimed that it was an effective force of 4,000 men and more than 300 guns, mostly heavy ordnance. It was published almost 5 months before any American ship left for Japan. The image and story, however, were quite misleading because Perry left the U.S. and sailed to Japan, commanding an armada of only 1 ship. Perry was quite unhappy at this. Nevertheless, he thought the time was of the essence due to the Russians and got underway with only his flagship, the Mississippi, a ship whose construction he had personally overseen. The squadron, he thought, could be put together once he arrived in East Asia. It was Perry's first time to sail the Pacific, a voyage that would, with stops, take over half a year. From Luchu, or Okinawa as we know it, which he would later forcibly open to trade, a squadron of 4 rather than 12 ships, 2 of which were steam-powered warships, assembled and headed to Japan. Even with this number of ships, the history of Japan, the United States, indeed global history, would be forever changed. The day before Perry's ships anchored in Edo Bay, a brilliant meteor, described as a large blue sphere with a red wedge-shaped tail, streaked across the sky. A Lieutenant Dewar, who was in command of the watch, wrote, The ancients would have construed this remarkable appearance of the heavens as an omen, promising a favorable issue to an enterprise undertaken by them, and we may pray God that our present attempt to bring a singular and half-barbarous people into the family of civilized nations may succeed without resort to bloodshed. In thus describing the Japanese, Durer was expressing a commonly held view, though one not held to the same extent by several of the civilian members of the expedition. Perry himself was not immune to such opinions, writing that he anticipated encountering, quote, a weak and barbarous people. While these were less than enlightened views, Americans did not have access to a lot of solid information on Japan prior to the Perry mission. Witness, for example, this fanciful image from Gleason's pictorial of a Chinese-style Japanese court that also repeated the mistaken belief that the emperor, rather than the shogun, held power. When the black ships, so called because of their black hulls and the smoke they spewed, anchored in Edo Bay, they were immediately approached by a large number of Japanese boats, which attempted to surround them, just as they had Biddle's ships. Perry's response was to threaten to fire into them. Bayard Taylor wrote, "Our steam engines, the first that ever paddled in Japanese waters, and our big guns had their effect." The Japanese ships quickly gave way. According to engineer George B. Gideon, who wrote no fewer than 51 letters to his wife while on board the mission, "Coming up the bay, we were at quarters, everything cleared for action, the guns shotted and all ready for the fight. I opine there will be no blood spilled, but we shall see what we shall see." In the interest of time, I have to greatly abbreviate here the first encounters between the Americans and the Japanese. There were failed attempts, for example, to get the Americans to move, to go down to Nagasaki, where foreign ships were supposed to go. But several days later, a high-level Japanese official was allowed on board, together with his 2 interpreters. These men were shown about the ship. Bayard Taylor, the official writer on the mission, wrote, they, quote, "evinced more information than could have been expected, laughed and were untiring in their attention to cherry brandy." They recognized a daguerreotype, an early form of camera, and called it by name. They pointed out larger American cities on a map and knew the boundaries of Mexico. This was a startling amount of information for an allegedly closed-off country. At one point, the Japanese official, apparently not so intoxicated as Taylor may have thought, wished to know why 4 ships of war were necessary to deliver 1 letter, meaning President Fillmore's official letter, which presented America's demands to the Japanese government. After a few days of negotiation, it was agreed Perry would present Fillmore's letter to high-ranking Japanese officials on shore. This is a copy of Fillmore's letter to the Japanese officials. It was friendly in tone, Fillmore reassuring the emperor, or the man he called the emperor, that the Constitution and laws of the U.S. forbid all interference with the religious or political concerns of other nations. I particularly charge Commodore Perry to abstain from every act which could possibly disturb the tranquility of your Imperial Majesty's dominions. The letter explained why the Japanese should change their ancient laws and suggested Japan might try a 5 or 10-year trial period. It clearly stated America's objectives, as you can see, friendship, commerce, a supply of coal and provisions, and protection for our shipwrecked people. As friendly as the letter was, it nonetheless suggested that American demands were backed up by a powerful show of force: 2 steam-driven frigates, 2 sloops, armed with a complement of 65 guns and slightly fewer than 1,000 men. The Japanese, of course, had no knowledge that the squadron wasn't as big as Perry had wanted. Its size and composition were shocking enough, even with just 4 vessels, especially when these seemingly demonic-looking vessels threatened Edo, the capital of more than 1 million residents. Perry also dispatched a letter to the Japanese government, taking a harder tone than the president. He stressed that, quote, "no friendship can long exist unless Japan ceases to act towards Americans as if they were her enemies. It is wise and impractical," he wrote, "for Japan to maintain its policy of national seclusion, and hope the Japanese government will see the necessity of averting unfriendly collision between the 2 nations." So, 5 days after the ships appearing off Edo Bay, Commodore Perry went ashore. The American ships remained at broadside, cannon directed towards land. About 15 American boats brought an entourage of 300 armed officers, Marines, and musicians on shore. a scene captured by one of the expedition's official artists, William Hine. As Perry landed, a half-dozen drums rolled and 2 bands played the then unofficial national theme, Hail Columbia. If all works well, you will hear Hail Columbia. A little bit. Or not.
The arrow, hover over it again.
It worked in the test, of course. That's okay. Okay. I'm not going to hum it for you.
I'm just making sure
You're gonna-
it's shut down.
Oh.
Yeah, you gotta restart.
Got to restart the whole thing?
Well, it's not, you have to, yeah.
I'll defer to you.
Okay, so open it up again.
Where is it?
I don't know.
It's on the stick. I'm not a PC person.
Okay. Let's see if we can
Where's the
find
stick?
it.
Oh, right there, Lipitz.
This one?
Yep.
Okay, let's go.
Just to recapture.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll skip the Hail Columbia.
I was gonna say I could try.
You try?
I would
Okay,
try it.
we'll try it.
Okay, that's gonna be a no. Oh, wait.
There we go. Hey, Courtney. So you get the picture. Thank you. Bayard Taylor, who is attached to Perry's staff, reacted to the moment. Wow, okay. Twice. Now we can't stop it. Wow. So Taylor wrote a letter to his mother, whom he frequently wrote to. For the first time in more than 200 years, a foreign embassy has landed on the shores of Japan. And from the manner in which we have been received, or rather compelled the Japanese to receive us, we have great hopes of the final success of the expedition. I never heard our national airs, by which he meant Hail Columbia, with so much delight as when our bands played them on Japanese soil. Wilhelm Hine, he said, made a grand painting of it, which will be engraved and published. Hine's image downplays, largely obscures the Japanese military presence. We do see in the image mostly the backs of a number of samurai in the foreground, but there were in fact about 5,000 Japanese troops in the area. Not surprisingly, they were detailed by Japanese illustrators, not Americans. After landing on shore, Perry walked towards the reception house that had been hastily built for the presentation of the president's letter to the Shogun's officials. In front of him was a bodyguard of 2 tall African-American men and 2 young boys carrying the very expensive black lacquer box containing the president's letter, as twin bands played the Ben Bolt Quickstep. I'm not going to try and play that one. In a solemn ceremony, the 2 men carefully opened the box, placed the letters on top, and withdrew. William Hine captured that scene too, or a part of it. After the presentation of the presidential letter, Perry announced that he'd be back in the spring, and yes, with more ships. His large landing party marched back to the boats to the accompaniment of more music. Back on board his flagship, Perry and the Black Ships proceeded further up the bay to explore, 20 miles further than any foreign ship had ever been, and within sight of the great city of Edo. 4 days later, the Americans were gone. As the squadron weighed anchor and started for Okinawa, Taylor commented that they, quote, in the space of 10 days, accomplished more than any other nation had been able to effect for the last 2 centuries. The universal feeling on board was one of honest pride and exaltation. Knowing the caution and duplicity of the people with whom we had to deal, it was a satisfaction to find all their arts of diplomacy completely shattered by our simple, straightforward, resolute course adopted by Commodore Perry. End quote. For a variety of reasons that I won't get into now, Perry didn't press his demands and insist on an immediate response. Instead, the squadron returned to Okinawa and to China for the winter, giving the Japanese leadership some time to think on America's demands. Bayard Taylor, quite remarkably, decided to return home. Back in the U.S., he received a letter from his friend, William Hine, who remained with the expedition, updating him on the news that the Japanese had put the Russians off on any treaty until all matters with Perry had been settled. He reminded Taylor, though, that there still may be conflict. He said there are still two different courses which the Japanese may follow, and if they rather perish than abandon a policy which proved as good for nearly 2 centuries, then we will have a hard and bloody work before us, and many that went out to Japan will not return home. On the other side, everybody knows that the Japanese are a wise people and will come to a conclusion that sooner or later they will have to abandon their past ways. He went on to tell Taylor, they will try hard, quote, to humbug us with their Asiatic tricks. Thank God our Commodore is not the man to be humbugged. That's one of the most popular words in 1850s America, it seemed, was humbugging. There, my dear Bayard, we approach one of the most interesting moments in modern history, and I feel justly proud to be at once spectator and actor in this great event. The Americans returned in February of 1854, several months earlier than promised, again due to concern with the Russians. Perry did manage to keep his promise to return with a larger force, a scene captured by an anonymous Japanese artist you see here. He returned not with the 12 ships that Gleason's described, but with a substantial force of 9 vessels nonetheless. On board were almost 2,000 men, almost double the earlier visit, but not the 4,000 that Gleason's advertised, and over 100 rather than 300 guns that Gleason's had earlier advertised. But his ships were equipped with the latest military technology, Pake-Saw guns, cannons capable of wreaking great explosive destruction. The American expedition has been rightly viewed as an exercise in gunboat diplomacy. Some critics in the U.S. call the expedition a, quote, invasion of Japan. The New York Evening Post opined that the intention was for the mission, quote, to procure from the Japanese by terror privileges which no nation has yet been able to procure by negotiation. Some of the participants were also highly critical of Perry's heavy-handedness as he pushed the limits of nonviolence and covered up the coercive elements of his policy towards the Japanese. William Hine, the artist, clearly saw that the expedition was an act of aggression against Japan. The use of force, whether actual or implied, was required to open Japan in 1853, just as it was in 1945. There is, in fact, a clear connection between Perry's flagship, the USS Powhatan, seen at left, and General Douglas MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri, where he accepted the surrender of Japan. Behind MacArthur, in the upper left of this famous photograph, is none other than the flag that flew on Perry's flagship almost 100 years earlier, which you see in the image on the left. What is also striking about this juxtaposition of images is that Perry and MacArthur were actually distant relatives. Didn't make that up. The coercive nature of the forced opening in 1853-1854 was also not lost on another World War II figure, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the brainchild of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto famously said that he had entered the Japanese Imperial Naval Academy in order one day to be able to return Perry's visit to Japan. The mere presence of the black ships in Edo Bay was in and of itself threatening. But under Perry's leadership, the Americans assumed an aggressive stance, using tactics of intimidation, as noted before by threatening to fire into Japanese ships if they didn't move, also by firing all the cannon on board his flagship on the squadron's very first day in Japan. This was on July 8, 1853, though Perry later informed the Japanese disingenuously that this was supposedly in celebration of the American Independence Day. In addition, over the objections of local Japanese officials, American boats conducted surveying operations on the coastline of Edo Bay and surrounding waters. The dotted line in the map at right traces their route. Tension was high and the potential for conflict great when on the first visit to Japan, Americans began surveying the harbor and were challenged by Japanese forces in small boats, as depicted in rather dramatic fashion by Hine in this painting entitled Passing the Rubicon. This is an allusion to Julius Caesar entering Roman territory by crossing the Rubicon in 49 BCE, beginning a civil war that signaled the end of the Roman Republic. In the Japanese context, it marked the beginning of the end of Japan's seclusion. This image was not included in the 3-volume official record of the expedition later published by the U.S. government, to downplay the coercive nature of the American mission. When American boats surrounded the waters around Edo Bay, it was always under the protection of a steam-powered warship. They penetrated Edo Bay to within sight of the great capital, sending its inhabitants into a panic. Perry's tactics of intimidation were also in full display in the short note he delivered to Japanese officials, together, none too subtly, with a white flag, instructing them that were they to take up arms, quote, "the victory will naturally be ours, and you shall by no means overcome us. In such a situation," he continued, "you should put up the white flag, and we would accordingly stop firing and conclude peace with you, turning our battleships aside." The message was quite clear about the consequences of refusing American demands. Tellingly, the note was another historical document not included in the official account of the mission, over which Perry had complete editorial privilege. For in taking this action, Perry might have been viewed as exceeding his orders. The coercive nature of the expedition has also been underplayed for reasons other than Perry's control over the official narrative. It did not become a prominent part of the legacy of the expedition because the Japanese leadership decided not to engage the foreigners militarily, as the Chinese had done with disastrous consequences in the Opium War. The gun batteries, marked in black on the map on the right in Edo Bay, were kept silent, though this was likely because of the recognition that they were outdated and would be ineffective. On a short research trip to Japan this past summer, I went to see some of the old gun batteries in what is now Tokyo Bay. And seeing this replica of the Statue of Liberty on Odaiba, overlooking one of the battery islands, I wondered if Japanese visitors, or foreign tourists for that matter, appreciated the remarkable irony of this symbol of America overlooking the batteries that were meant to keep Americans and all other foreigners away. The Japanese leadership, learning their lesson from China's mistakes, chose to negotiate rather than resist American imperialism, to negotiate to deflect as much as possible the impact of those demands. When the Americans returned to Japan in 1854 with 9 vessels, they presented a formidable military force, one that was also captured by Hein in this lithograph. The shogunate had already decided to virtually accept all demands in the president's letter, but Japanese officials nonetheless procrastinated for weeks over issues such as the site for the negotiations. Perry lost his temper, made threats, said, "I'll be back with 100 ships," even though that was more than there were in the U.S. Navy probably on that date. But overall, he treated the Japanese with firmness, yet also with dignity, and he came to like his unwilling hosts, who eventually relented. The end result of the decision to negotiate rather than resist was the Treaty of Kanagawa. Unlike the Treaty of Nanking the British imposed on China, the Kanagawa Treaty involved no cession of land, no reparations. It was a diplomatic rather than a commercial treaty that opened up only 2 ports, Shimoda, south of Edo in the east, and Hakodate, way up north, but not Edo itself, which Perry had wanted. Neither port was located near major population areas. This was a major victory for the Japanese side because it kept Americans well away from the capital city and, importantly, well away from the imperial city of Kyoto, where the emperor resided. It also bought the shogunate, some time to deal with the domestic political fallout of breaking its centuries-old policy of exclusionism. To Perry's credit, he did not insist on imposing a commercial treaty, believing it would be to America's benefit to first engage the Japanese in this way, and that they would come to see for themselves the benefit of trade with America. The Treaty of Kanagawa did call for a consul to reside in Japan, and he would negotiate the commercial treaty in due time. According to engineer George Gideon, quote, "Perry appeared to be very much pleased with his success," end quote. And later in the evening, he invited guests into his private quarters and showed off the treaty to them. During the weeks-long period of negotiations, there was great opportunity for interaction between Americans and Japanese, and great opportunity for the 2 countries' artists and to document it. The Japanese, for example, put on a sumo wrestling tournament demonstration. The middle image is, by the way, by Hein. I'm sorry, the image on the right. The Americans performed military maneuvers with musical accompaniment, as in these two, captured in these two anonymous Japanese images. There were also minstrel shows performed by crewmen in blackface, a popular but highly offensive form of American culture that emerged during the 1830s. Roughly 200 Japanese watched one such performance aboard Perry's flagship. According to Chief Purser William Spiden, the Japanese, quote, were kept in one incessant roar of laughter, end quote. Although, of course, the cherry cordial and champagne accounted for at least some of that. Why Perry used black minstrelsy to communicate American culture to the Japanese, along with the prominent placement of black bodies in the ceremonial presentation of the presidential letter, is something perhaps that we can talk about during the Q&A. There was also other musical entertainment during a celebratory dinner. You can see the band up top. Musical and theatrical entertainment were important to the success of the mission, Perry felt, as a way to boost morale. He brought on the expedition an Italian conductor to work with the two bands and encouraged the crew to put on theatrical performances and so-called Ethiopian concerts during the trip. Of course, the Japanese officials also hosted the Americans, who loved the sake but hated the sushi. And of course, an exchange of gifts took place. The gifts were part of a larger commercial strategy meant to entice a, quote, half-civilized people into the benefits of trade with the U.S. Perry was selling American technological innovation, so the gifts included a variety of firearms, a daguerreotype camera, 2 telegraph instruments with 3 miles of wire, clocks, stoves, farm implements, a French copper lifeboat, 2 folios of James Audubon's Birds of America, a variety of American liquors, and most importantly, a quarter-size locomotive with tenders, car, and track. In the far distance, in the image at the top left, you can see poles carrying telegraph wire. Samuel Morse personally instructed one of Perry's lieutenants in Morse code so the instruments could be set up and demonstrated in Japan, only a decade after their first demonstration in the U.S. And in the foreground is another gift, a small barrel of whiskey. This, of course, marks the beginning of the Japanese craze for whiskey, which continues today. The Japanese, in turn, responded with a variety of traditional handicraft goods. And upon learning of Perry's personal hobbies, a collection of seashells. Yes, he was into conchology. And also 2 dogs. The American reaction to the Japanese gifts was underwhelming. The Commodore himself called them a meager display and a great disappointment. Perry brought back most but not all of the gifts he received from the Japanese government. Many of them are in the Smithsonian today. No one knows, though, what happened, for example, to what a Lieutenant Preble called a, quote, box of obscene paintings of naked men and women, by which he meant shunga. Perry did bring back some 300 living trees, plants, and shrubs. These were transported to Washington, D.C. for storage in greenhouses built on the Capitol grounds. Dried specimens were taken to Harvard College to be classified by Dr. Asa Gray, the most important biologist of the day. Gray and his staff worked at breakneck speed to examine and classify the plants in time to include in the official account of the expedition. Well, what became of those living trees and other plants I've yet to determine, but I'm interested to find out. I'd like to now switch gears and talk about the civilian members of the crew, some of whom you see in the Japanese images here, but we'll focus in a few minutes on 2 of them, Bayard Taylor, the writer, and his friend William Hind, the artist. When news of the expedition spread in the U.S. in 1852, a large number of people clamored to get a place on board it. Some prominent families used whatever influence they had to try and get their sons on board, even in a minor role. John Lewis and his twin brother Lawrence, sons of Virginia aristocracy, found their way aboard as master's mates, having joined the Navy just to see Japan. It appears that their family friend, Smith Lee, captain of the Mississippi and older brother of Robert E. Lee, made this happen. The Lewis brothers were very well connected. Their paternal grandfather was George Washington's nephew, and Lawrence was married to Eleanor Parke Curtis, granddaughter of Martha Washington. John Lewis began his diary of the expedition with the jingoistic sentiment, quote, "The American eagle allows little birds to sing," end quote, and later recounted that, quote, "Often in childhood had my imagination wandered to this unknown region of the world, hoping that by some enchantment I might be wafted here," end quote. I believe this was a common sentiment. Intellectuals clamored to get a spot, and Perry turned them all down. He was opposed to the appointment of any civilians to the expedition for a variety of reasons, including the fact that, as he wrote, the object of the expedition was not scientific, but naval and diplomatic. To attempt both would probably be to succeed at neither. He was also concerned about the rivalry with European nations and wanted to keep a tight rein on security. And those scientific gentlemen, as he called them, would insist on sharing information with their friends and family. Despite these rather strong initial views, his thinking quickly evolved, and in the end, he opted for an expedition not just to open the ports of Japan, but to study the country, its history, its geography, and to record as much about it as he could. This information, according to the official narrative, quote, would replace America's misperceptions about Japan, while helping to lay the base for trade by answering a number of basic questions. Who are the Japanese? What do they consume? What do they wear? What do they grow and produce? What are their material needs? Congress, however, balked at giving him the funding he wanted for a scientific mission. So for that work, he depended largely on his own officers, people like his flag captain, George Jones, who had expertise in geology and astronomy. Despite the lack of funding, Perry was not to be foiled by an uncooperative Congress and began to hire intellectuals, artists, and scientists as acting master's mates at the low rate pay of $25 a month. This allowed him to carry out this important part of the mission, while at the same time keeping these civilians under naval law. This was especially important because the Navy had abolished flogging in 1850, a change that Perry was not at all happy about. None of the newly minted master's mates were military men by training, and one of them, the missionary, S. Wells Williams, particularly balked under the strictures of military life and butted heads with Perry. Perry accepted 2 very high-profile artists and several score who applied to join his expedition, Hine, whom you see here at the bottom, and Eliphalet Brown, of whom, ironically, or maybe it's not ironic because he was a photographer, there are no photos of him, just Hine's depiction of him on the left, and perhaps he's one of the 2 figures that you see on the far left in the image in the middle there. Brown was a pioneering photographer who gave up a lucrative business in New York City to accompany Perry. He brought along his camera, the daguerreotype camera, which had only been invented in 1839, and kept himself busy making over 400 images, a number of which you see here. He recorded the first significant contact between Americans and Japanese and introduced a more authentic Japanese culture to the West. Besides a photographer, artist, and a writer, Perry also hired a French chef for diplomatic banquets. The chef actually made each of the 4 Japanese top officials a cake with their family crest on it, which pleased them immensely. And the Italian bandmaster I already mentioned to handle musical affairs. I've yet to research further. I wondered, did he make the chef and bandmaster enlist in the Navy as well? And of course, Perry needed translators since there were 3 languages recognized for official communications: Dutch for oral communications, classical Chinese and English for written documentation, but oddly, not Japanese. I can talk more about the translators in the Q&A if anyone would like, but Williams was not just a Chinese language interpreter and missionary, but also had a great love of science and some training in it, and he used this considerable knowledge of Asian flora that he gained over 20 years residence in China to assist the South Carolina scientist, Dr. James Morrow, in collecting plants. This was important not only because Japan had been a virtual blank on the global botanical map, but also because the knowledge gained, specifically that Japanese flora showed a remarkable similarity to the vegetation of the eastern North America, provided more evidence of the concept of plant migration that was vital to Darwin's theory on natural selection. The success of the expedition was publicized through the official report, seen here, which was published by the U.S. government, but was overseen exclusively by Perry, as I mentioned. Volume 1 was based on Perry's journals and those of at least 10 other officers, and the official writer Taylor's account. The volume was beautifully illustrated with 165 woodcuts and lithographs, mostly by Hine, and many of these in color, depicting not just Japan, but other stops on the way. Remarkably, it was ready for publication in just 7 months. The official record was expensive and not meant for the general public, but an affordable trade edition of Volume 1 was published the same year, with fewer lithographs and with just black and white images, as you see here. At the same time, a small number of illustrations, including some that did not appear in either the official or commercial publications, were reproduced independently as large, brightly colored, quote, elephant lithographs, an example of which you see here. In short, Americans could encounter the Perry mission in a variety of visual formats. The second and third volumes followed in 1857. Volume 2 was a collection of scientific essays written by members of the expedition and contained several hundred brilliantly colored plates devoted to natural life, especially fishes and birds. They were produced by Hine with the assistance of Morrow. Morrow was actually sent by the State Department without consulting Perry to join the mission in Hong Kong, and proved to be another thorn in Perry's side. Morrow took seeds, plants, and agricultural implements from the U.S. to give to the Japanese, and in turn collected seeds and plants for American nurseries for the possible improvement of American agriculture. His journal was to have been published with Perry's official narrative, but he refused to hand it over. The official narrative was also supposed to contain additional plates depicting the plants of Japan, but Morrow held those back too, in hopes of publishing them in his own book. This never happened, and unfortunately the illustrations subsequently were lost. Volume 3 was a study of zodiacal light and had little impact. Perry lived to see the publication of all 3 volumes, but died just a few months later. Perhaps he sensed that because he put such great effort to see the project to its speedy conclusion. A number of the civilians on board were already famous before they joined the mission. This was certainly true of Bayard Taylor, who was friends with a lot of famous people in America, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Russell Lowell, Mark Twain, and Horace Greeley, the renowned newspaper editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, America's foremost newspaper of the day, for whom he also worked. Taylor was a dynamic public speaker, a celebrity, one whose obituary was published on the front page of the New York Times. Yet today, he's largely a forgotten man of letters. Over a career spanning 32 years, he wrote 17 volumes of poetry, 4 novels, 8 critical works, and translations of German classics. His translation of Faust was widely praised, 21 travel narratives, innumerable magazine essays, newspaper stories and reviews, a children's book called The Ballad of Abraham Lincoln, and incredibly, some 4,000 letters. He also wrote an ode for the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, and, as you can see, an ode for the centennial held in Philadelphia. He published his first collection of poetry in 1844 and always thought of himself as a poet. But by 24, he had made a name for himself as a travel writer. His book, Views Afoot, or Europe Seen with a Knapsack and Staff, was terribly popular, going through 24 editions in 13 years. He was one of a number of American authors that was terribly popular, whose publishers presented their works in collected editions. The 11 volumes in Bayard Taylor's Travels was issued by G.P. Putnam and Son. Other people like James Fenimore Cooper, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Ralph Waldo Emerson also had this honor. The Baltimore Sun called him, quote, the greatest traveler in the world known, and in the known world, and, quote, an unparalleled sensation among the literati. Taylor was not America's first travel writer, to be sure, but he traveled to gain the material to write the articles and books that supported him financially. The more he reported, the farther he had to travel to find new places: the Sudan, the Arctic Circle, India, China, and Japan. In the center image, we see him in native garb, which he was always keen to wear. He was very open to new experiences, like the potent dose of hashish he enjoyed in Damascus, and which caused him hallucinations and a multi-day stupor. Almost everywhere he went, he picked up the local language and gained an insider's view. His Arabic became so good that he could walk into mosques unchallenged, but he remained an outsider in China and Japan, unable to communicate with locals, an Orientalist bringing to America the glamour of the exotic East. His far-flung travel, though, always confirmed the cultural and racial superiority of America and its people. He educated Americans about their place on the racial map in the world, writing, quote, Every important triumph which man has achieved since his creation belongs to the Caucasian race. Our mental and moral superiority is self-evident. This is the way he thought. Taylor was on one of his journeys in Europe in 1852 when his editor at the Tribune suggested he accompany Perry to Japan. Taylor had been away from home for over a year and was tired, but the paper offered him very good terms, better than usual, so he agreed. Taylor knew Japan as a mysterious place, and by joining the expedition, he would become one of the first of his countrymen to see it. It was, in short, the story of the century. He waited in Constantinople for almost a month, grew even more tired, and was on the verge of leaving when he received the letter he had been waiting for from the Tribune. It contained funds for the trip, but not the permission he needed from the Secretary of the Navy to join the expedition. This meant he was on his own and would have to persuade Perry, as no one had yet been able to do. So Taylor made his way east to China to wait for Perry without any assurance of success. After Perry arrived in Hong Kong, Taylor was able to get an interview with him. Unfortunately, neither man writes about their meeting in any detail. Taylor had a number of friends on board the USS Susquehanna, Perry's flagship, for most of the expedition, and one of them, a Captain Franklin Buchanan, applied to have him as his clerk. Baltimore-born Buchanan was the first superintendent of the Naval Academy. Perry refused, and for a few days Taylor wrote, "I had not the slightest hopes of going." However, something changed, and Perry agreed to take him on, not as Captain Buchanan's clerk, but as a master's mate. According to Taylor, because I should then be under his immediate command and could accompany him on all his official visits and excursions on shore. This will give me the very position I seek. In the end, Perry seems to have fallen for Bayard Taylor's considerable charm, and likely knowing of his reputation, agreed for him to join on the flagship. In any case, Taylor took credit for changing Perry's mind. Taylor was the perfect choice for writer on Perry's gunboat diplomacy. His travel writing had proven his ability to penetrate an alien society in order to represent it. This amounted to a tacit assertion of his, and by extension his readers' ability to dominate it. This connection between travel writing and cultural dominance that was always implicit in his work became explicit when he gained a spot on Perry's mission. So on May 8, 1853, Taylor secured a coveted spot on the expedition, becoming what we refer to today as an embedded journalist. Back in the U.S., the Tribune announced its big coup in getting its man aboard in an editorial on August 19th. Signing an oath of allegiance, Taylor, the writer, became a master's mate. In his words, he, quote, became an officer of very moderate rank with unlimited respect for my superiors and the reverse for my inferiors. Still, Taylor made friends easily, even with common sailors, and appears to have adjusted well to naval life. In addition, his intellect and quick eye for detail led to an elevation of his duties from mere observer to participant, as when the squadron stopped at the Bonin Islands, he was put in charge of the shore party sent on a 2-day exploration. Although Taylor signed on as writer, he liked to sketch. This is one of his works. He sketched the artists with whom he not only shared a mess, but also bunked. Hine, the artist, Portman, the Dutch translator, Eliphalet Brown, the photographer, and William B. Draper, a civilian engineer who was in charge of the telegraph apparatus. The ship was so crowded that it was a problem where to put them, but they were finally placed upon the oarlock deck, 3 decks down, within the bowels of the ship, beside the main hatch and over the powder magazine. The unpleasant living conditions were suggested by another sketch of Taylor's, which depicts the men, shirtless and pantless, sweating profusely, with some of them looking with suspicion at their Chinese steward. Taylor gave up his journal at the end of the expedition as required by Perry's General Order No. 1, and his narrative became the most important source for the official account of the first mission, but he never got it back. And Julie Kim and Aaron Durham Wright and a number of naval researchers and I have all been unsuccessful in trying to locate it. Nevertheless, Taylor hadn't planned on there being 2 trips to Japan and refused to wait for the second one. He was in a hurry to go home, even if it was to tell only part of the story. Perry gave him permission to resign, again knowing he would return to the U.S. and publicize the expedition. But in doing so, Taylor missed the second visit to Japan, which was really the bigger story. Nevertheless, back in the U.S., Taylor found a large audience waiting for his return and wanted to capitalize upon it by publishing a book quickly, which you see here, in advance of Perry's authorized account. Even if the report on Japan would have to depend on his memory and his press articles rather than his journal. In the pages, Taylor revealed his admiration for the Japanese and their industrious, disciplined nature. Their faces, he wrote, denoted a lively and active mind. They were tall, handsomely formed men with vigorous and symmetrical bodies, in contrast to the Chinese, who were physically inferior, ugly and filthy, with dull faces without expression. It's a man with opinions. Here he partially reveals his infatuation with the pseudoscience of physiognomy, which allowed him with a mere glance to determine the moral and intellectual traits of a given race. His views of race, egalitarianism, and imperialism are an important avenue, I think, for further study. But getting back to his book, despite the fact that he was only a member on the first visit to Japan, it went through 18 editions over the next 44 years. Taylor sought to capitalize on the interest in him and the expedition, touring the country from coast to coast, giving hundreds of lectures at an exhausting pace. An accomplished orator, he packed the audiences and gave them a glimpse of the exotic places they might never see. In fact, he spoke for 2 consecutive nights in Baltimore, writing his mother, quote, "I had an even greater success the second night in Baltimore than the first. Some said there were 5,000 persons present, and all agreed that it was the largest audience which any man had ever addressed there." His lucrative career as a public speaker helped fund his lifestyle, including his extensive travels. It paid for him to build a large home on 130 acres over the Maryland border in Kennett Square, PA, called Cedarcroft, which cost him the princely sum of $15,000, and recently just sold for $1.3 million. In his life after Japan, Taylor remained an active lecturer and writer, but also began a diplomatic career, serving for a time as chargé d'affaires of the Russian legation in St. Petersburg. After returning to the U.S., he gave a series of lectures on Russia and its history, one of which President Lincoln attended, after which he wrote him a nice letter of admiration. In 1870, Taylor published a novel, Joseph and His Friend, that is frequently cited as America's first gay novel. As a noted scholar of German literature, he received a non-residential professorship at Cornell. His last book on Japan was published in 1872, and 6 years later he passed away while serving as ambassador to Germany. It was a whirlwind kind of life. Lastly, and far more briefly, I turn to the artist Wilhelm Heine. Unlike Bayard Taylor, Heine didn't have to lobby for the job. He was one of America's leading illustrators and selected by Perry as the official artist of the mission. Born in Dresden, Heine was a so-called 48er, fleeing the May Uprising, one of the revolutions in the German states in 1848, and landed not in Baltimore, like the people my teaching assistant Martha Berkemeyer is studying, but in New York City, where he set up his studio on Broadway. He quickly made a reputation for himself in the U.S., and not just as a painter. Through happenstance, the illustrator also temporarily became a consular aide and found himself negotiating a commercial agreement between the U.S. and several Central American countries. He personally delivered the agreements to the government in Washington, where he met President Fillmore and Perry. Perry was so impressed he selected him for the position over several score other applicants. Heine was there for both trips to Japan. He worked primarily with sketch pad and watercolors and produced over 400 images. In Perry's diary, he repeatedly wrote, "Mr. Heine took a sketch of it. Mr. Heine took a sketch of it." Heine went everywhere, up a tree or a cliff, whatever it took for a look at the view or an event. And occasionally, he inserted himself into the images, as you see below, as a witness to history. Thanks to his work, the official government reported the expedition was the most widely illustrated American event before the Civil War. Heine brought to his art what has been described as a gentle, panoramic, romantic realism in terms of both the selection and execution of his subjects. He was clearly enraptured by the new landscapes and culture around him. In his various paintings of Shimoda, one of which you see here, his paintbrush exhibited great romanticism, capturing detailed scenes often crowded with people, with Japanese and Americans intermingling with little sense of tension or aggression or strangeness. Typically, he depicted people in substantial numbers and rarely lingered on the exotic or the sensational, or spent effort on social types, even when depicting samurai. Since neither he nor anyone else on the Perry mission ever visited Edo or any other large urban center, his illustrations conveyed the impression that Japan was a peaceful, rustic land of quiet villages and modest towns. Even when he depicted religious structures and statues, he exhibited great sensitivity, restraint, and respect, in contrast to the more garish renderings of imagined heathen deities that appeared in Western media before Perry's arrival. The same was true in his long written account, where he also described the Buddhist burial rituals that followed the Episcopalian funeral performed by the American chaplain after a seaman died. Oddly, paying the Buddhist priest 80 cents to officiate at the burial service was the first purchase that Americans made after signing the Treaty of Kanagawa. I think it also showed great respect for the Japanese religious custom. With one notable exception, Perry did not illustrate any subject, I'm sorry, I said Perry, I meant Hine, did not illustrate any subject that would have provoked shock or moral indignation, such as prostitution or pornography. The one exception was a public bath, where it was customary for men, women, and children to bathe together. Good Christians found them appalling. Dr. James Morrow, the expedition's botanist, denounced the one he witnessed in Shimoda as, quote, an example of the licentiousness and degradation of these cultivated heathen. It is no surprise that the image was removed from later editions of the narrative. While some Americans saw mixed bathing as a sign of Japanese lewdness, it's important to remember how subjectively social customs can be viewed. Years later, a famous Japanese traveler in the U.S. would write about the disgusting spectacle of American men and women kissing in public. The sketches, paintings, and lithographs Hine produced were a major part of the official iconography of the expedition, a record of the beginning of official relations between the two countries, and an important record of Japan as it was before it felt the full force of Western impact. After his return to New York in 1855, Hine published a number of books on Japan, beginning with A Journey Around the Earth to Japan, which is translated into several languages, but only in 1990 into English, for reasons that I don't understand. He also published a collection of prints, graphic scenes of the Japan expedition, as well as the single-sheet prints I talked about earlier. He lived a fascinating life. After Perry, he served again as the official artist on the Prussian diplomatic mission to establish relations with Japan, China, and Siam. Then, hearing about the outbreak of the Civil War in the U.S., he returned and volunteered for the Union Army, joining the 1st Maryland Infantry. He left the Army in 1865 after being made a brevet brigadier general. After the war, he served as U.S. consul in Paris and later in Liverpool, finally returning in 1871 to his homeland, to Dresden, where he lived out the rest of his years, and wrote yet one more book about Japan. On his return, Perry left the expedition at Hong Kong and made his long way home via Europe, where news of his success preceded him. He was celebrated in European capitals, where royals and politicians wanted to learn about Japan. In the U.S., however, for reasons I don't yet fully understand, he never received much official recognition from the government for the Japan expedition after he returned to America, other than a check for $20,000, from which he helped pay for the official record. Perhaps it was, as I suggested earlier, the political climate in the U.S. had turned darker, and on the eve of the Civil War, there was division in the air and far less concern about trade and diplomatic relations with Asia. However, businessmen in New York City celebrated the success of the mission, and news of the expedition spread across America through the official government report and its mass market edition, as well as through the work of Bayard Taylor, William Hine, Eliphalet Brown. Without them and the other civilian members of the expedition, Perry would not have been able to reap the full scientific rewards of opening Japan. He would not have been able to communicate successfully with the Japanese and would not have been able to publicize the success of his mission as effectively. In short, the civilian members of the expedition played an indispensable role that should be highlighted. After the arrival of the black ships, Japan underwent great changes. Writing to Taylor almost a decade after the expedition, the translator S.W. Williams reflected, quote, how rapid and extensive have been the changes in the world, in our own country. Japan has opened wonderfully easily in relation to other countries since the timid old Prince of Izu took that letter, meaning President Fillmore's letter, and I hope there are yet large advances for her. Little did he know that the Japanese Tokugawa government would fall in just 8 years. The appearance of the black ships had set in motion political changes that it could not handle, and it was toppled after a relatively brief civil war in 1868. By this time, of course, the United States had come apart in its own civil war and reemerged battered but still intact. In Japan, the new Meiji government that took power wisely chose to honor the treaties entered into by its predecessor. Diplomatic and commercial relations with the U.S. and other Western countries not only remained in place, but continued to grow. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to any questions.
Thank you so much, Constantine, for that. I hope that there are people who will stick around and ask some questions. I'll let you field your own. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please.
So like in American diplomats, well, I mean like the politicians, do you like to type like that they're ready for like isolationist like sort of like sentiments from them? Because a lot of times when it comes to American expansion for isolationism, that's like usually a conflict. I wonder if that was present here as well.
I'm not sure I followed your question. Was isolationism present in the
U.S.
in the view?
A lot of the time, like from the days of George Washington, even like there was a sentiment that anything outside
Yeah.
of the North American economy was not American business.
Yeah. Well, I make the disclaimer that I'm not an American historian, but there is this tension, I think, and American historians can add to it. There are tensions, of course, I think, that we see pretty constant about, whether America should venture abroad or not, whether it's in Cuba or Philippines or you name it. There are these pretty heated debates in American society about the role America should take. So they're kind of twin impulses, isolationism and expansionism. American historians are welcome to expound or contradict or, yes.
I don't have that for you, but
Okay.
You did share some images of, that were produced by Japanese, but could you maybe briefly share with us a little bit of their perspective on Perry and his crew? Like, do we see the same kind of, hideous language and superiority from the Japanese looking at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Americans?
That definitely exists as well. I could show you, a whole score of demonic images of Perry. Those are, and the image I showed of the demonic black ship actually was far outnumbered by really realistic portrayals of the black ships, which the Japanese had heard about. They knew that America had black ships from the Dutch and from the Chinese. They had never seen one. Well, they had seen one in a book, but not in real life. So it still was startling. But to answer your question, yes, those images exist. But there's really a really rich a wealth of visual documentary evidence from the Japanese side. Most of it is anonymous, but it shows both a fascination and a fear. And it's in the fear that you get the grotesque depictions, of course. Yeah. Yeah, Dan.
Constantine, this is fantastic stuff.
Thank you.
I see you're a historian of Japan, and yet looking at this story from the perspective of an American. How does being a historian of Japan change the story that Americans, including yourself, tell about this visit to Japan?
That remains to be seen, doesn't it? I'm not sure. It does, but I kind of feel like I have the backstory already. And although just finding out the amount of the story behind Bayard Taylor has involved incredible amount of back work just to get that little story out. It's the amount of documentary evidence is kind of overwhelming on the American side, especially now, thanks to COVID, everybody's digitized everything. And before you had to travel and make a few copies, and now with the touch of a button, it floods your screen.
I just wonder if I can follow that up.
Yeah, please.
Do you have the sense that some of the events, since you have the Japanese side as well?
No, I think they rightly perceive the forceful nature of the Americans' prodding of Japan, but you know, and we were just talking about this in my East Asian civilizations class. The Japanese had the benefit of having been able to see what went on in China first, so they were, you know, better prepared and more realistic. They knew that their centuries-old cannon weren't going to do much, so they didn't fire them. They didn't invite retribution on the part of America. So I think they had a really realistic sense of America, but they also did a lot to deflect America's demands in ways beyond what I was able to explain today. There's a great book called Negotiating Imperialism that talks about down to negotiating where the treaty would be negotiated. Every little point the Japanese pushed back on, and it drove Perry crazy, and so he made many threats. Yes, Amy.
Thank you, Constantine. I guess my question kind of follows up on Dan's.
Yeah.
So up until today, if you had asked me about the Perry expedition, I would have said it's a military diplomatic mission.
Yeah.
And I think your evidence is showing us it's so much more. So I just wanted to push you to kind of toot your own horn a little bit. So how much work is there on the fact that this was much more of an intellectual, cultural,
Yeah.
scientific expedition?
Th-
Is
th-
this a new thing that we're seeing with your sources?
Yeah, there's some, but not a lot, fortunately for me. In some of the books that I've read, Bayard Taylor will get one or two brief mentions. And he, even though he was a large part of the story, because I think it's so interesting, just the circumstances, William Hine is really the main character, and I want to focus on more, from this point on. Yeah, I wasn't able to highlight today, but I certainly think it'd be fruitful to stress the role of the mission as a scientific one. And here too, I think Perry was really influenced by Napoleon, by the U.S., I'm not going to forget the name of the expedition in the Northwest in the previous decade, in which both enlisted officers played a major role as scientists. So I think he saw himself as a successor to those attempts. And the second volume was all scientific papers, so I do want to look further into that. Yes.
To what extent have Japanese historians written of the Perry mission?
Oh, quite extensively. They haven't explored the American documents as I've done here, to the best of my knowledge. Although, as I said, I'm pretty new to this, so I'll be making more trips to Japan to ascertain, exactly what Japanese historians are doing. Pleasure. Yes, Jed.
If I understood correctly, so there was this tremendously, to our mind, ethnocentric viewpoint from Perry and so on. And you said not everyone shared that. I mean, was there always a counterstrain of people who said, no, this is a legitimate society? I mean,
Yeah.
Could you go into that a little bit?
Sure, thank you. Good question. I think William Hine is a prime example. And I don't know if it's because he was a recent immigrant to the United States, whether he was more sensitive to perception of others. But his account is very sensitive to the Japanese. I mentioned the funeral that took place, which he painted and also described. First the Episcopalian funeral, and then the Buddhist priest came and did another ceremony. And one would imagine, perhaps from what I said earlier, that in reading some of the more obnoxious ethnocentric statements, that the Americans wouldn't have welcomed that, but they did. And the paintings are quite, I think, they honor the Japanese culture and uphold it as being equal to their American culture. So there were exceptions. And as I read more and more of these accounts, which were supposed to be handed over to Perry, but not all of them were. A lot of people defied him and kept hidden their copies of their records. And Bayard Taylor's sketchbook, I don't know what the story is on that yet, because he had to hand over his diary, never got it back. But the sketchbook, I would think Perry wouldn't have been terribly happy about that. Yes, Praminda.
From the point of view of art history, modern
Yeah.
Western
Yeah.
art, this moment of the opening of Japan is a pivotal moment because the the exposure of
Right.
the Japanese woodblock prints really
Right.
transformed art for 20 years after this
Right.
moment. I mean, it completely changed the work of the French Impressionists and other artists. So it was just very interesting to me that there's this connection. And in response to the other gentleman's question,
Right.
I think that there were people who were receptive to the aesthetics of Japan, but I suppose they were still also thought of as marginal to Western society. The modern artists were not very well understood by their own society. So this is a very
Okay.
interesting, prehistory
Right.
of
Right.
art.
Right. A necessary precursor to
Right.
to the Japanism that follows. Right. Thank you. Yes, Carol.
I am struck by, and I wondered whether the image you showed us of the blackface performance was an American produced image or a Japanese
Oh,
produced.
that was Japanese. Yeah.
Because I'm fascinated by both the white supremacist narrative and then the use of black bodies and blackface in the
Yeah.
representation of American culture and power. And you invited us to ask more about that. So I wondered if you had
Yeah.
thoughts or had any insight.
I was hoping you would tell me. It's a seeming contradiction. That's in fact, Ann Rubin and I, Ann unfortunately had to leave early, but we were talking about that in her office. How can you have these two things? And I don't want to quote Ann, but I guess I will. She was saying just blackface was just so popular that there was kind of blinders on people as to the context. I don't know. I mean, how do you have a white supremacist attitude and then have blackface as the face of the expedition? Was it to unnerve the Japanese? Was it to break their formality? I've read some comments to that effect. The Japanese were very formal, and unless there was a lot of drinking going on and other things that helped to break down the formality. And blackface certainly would have done that. They thought it was hysterical. Maybe it's a way of building bridges, a very odd and perverse kind of way to do it, but yeah. Yes?
I was actually in our Civil War class, so we discussed this kind of stuff. So it might have just been like the cognitive dissonance, where it's like they can hold like the white supremacist mindset, but just completely just be into blackface and hold it up as superior comedy.
Yeah.
Just hold those thoughts separate and not even think about it.
Exactly. I think that's the only rational explanation, is to say there was a disconnect there. Yes, in the back, please.
My thought was like having the black people in the ceremony that you really wouldn't expect the white people to want them to be there for, and then having the minstrel shows. It makes me kind of wonder whether
Yeah.
the intent was to have like a common person to be superior over, because the Americans are going to think that they're superior over the Japanese. Like they were going to think that no matter what happened. They came into the mission thinking that, and they may or may not have anticipated that the Japanese would have thought themselves superior to the Americans. But you don't want to, like, if you're trying to do diplomacy, you don't want to make people feel bad about themselves. So
No,
the intent was to be like, at least you're not like the people who we think of as the worst ones.
Yep. I mean, Perry could be a bully and use tactics of intimidation. By the same token, he was very respectful of the Japanese. For example, when they had a banquet, he would have a separate table because he understood the hierarchical nature of Japanese society, that the higher-ups wouldn't want to sit with the lower people. In a variety of ways, but the whole ceremony, the letter wasn't just handed over. It was in a beautifully crafted, very expensive box. It was a solemn ceremony. It wasn't, even though the threat of force was ever present, he didn't make the Japanese grovel but to just make a further comment about the two tall African American bodyguards. In the official narrative, it describes them in some detail, And it's clear from the narrative that they were selected because they were tall and they were good looking.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't read a quote from it, but that was the, yes.
If the Japanese had been such a secluded culture, how did Perry know what rites, rituals, respects to
Yeah.
provide for them?
Yeah.
How did he have that information?
Right. Clearly, Americans were getting a mixed bag of information and misinformation about Japan, but Perry being Perry, he was very, very thorough. He read everything he could on Japan. He interviewed the captains of whaling ships who had been to Japan, whose men had been shipwrecked. He read Engelbert Kempfer's History of Japan, which was kind of the gospel on Japan, even though it dates to the early 18th century. He did all he could to find out about it. He interviewed the German, really the country's foremost expert on Japan, Franz von Siebold. He interviewed him for several days, but he didn't want to pick him as an interpreter because he wrote he feared he was a Russian spy. So he turned down the foremost expert on Japan, and he almost ended up, this is one thing I don't get, he goes to Asia without a Chinese interpreter. He knows that Williams is in Hong Kong, and he felt convinced that Williams would say yes. Williams hadn't signed on. So how he could have, the whole mission depended on the ability to have legal documents in Chinese language, which the Japanese could read, of course, classical Chinese. And to have left home without that, I don't know, it just really struck me. For a man who was so careful about so many things, that was really rather risky. Yeah. I don't know how we are on time, or
Out of time.
okay.
That's great. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much.